appreciate this opportunity to talk about myself and the city of Summit. My name is Mike Helmer. I've lived in Summit since 1987. I am a lawyer. I also practice law in the city of Summit as well as New York City. And while I've been in New York, in Summit, I've lived in 4 different locations: an apartment building on Summit Avenue, a small house over on Midland Terrace near Memorial Field, a bigger house on Oakland Place, and now on our current home on Prospect Street. I was formerly on the city council. I'm on the history committee of Baltusrol Golf Club, also a member of the Historical Society here, and have given pro bono legal services to the Westfield Historical Society as well as the Chatham Historical Society. I'm currently the chairman of the Summit Elks, which has been here since 1911, and involved in a number of local community activities. So Summit is a very interesting town. We have about 22,000 residents currently. It has been, obviously, people have lived here for thousands of years, and for the most part of that time, it was the Lenape Indian Native American tribe, which lived in and around the area. They were somewhat nomadic, so they didn't, from what I understand, set up permanent villages so much, but they did farm and hunt in the area, and were here for many hundreds of years before the European settlers came. This part of New Jersey and the Mid-Atlantic was originally first settled by the Dutch, Henry Hudson, who came to America in 1609 and sailed up the Hudson River to what's now Albany. When he returned, Holland, the Dutch, claimed most of New York and New Jersey as Dutch territory. That lasted until 1664, when Charles II, who returned, when the royalty returned to England, declared war on Holland in 1664, and as part of that made a claim to New York, what's now New York and New Jersey. And after invading New Amsterdam, which is now New York, in 1664 or 1666, I can't remember, the Dutch gave up their rights to New York and New Jersey and turned it over to the Duke of York, who was the younger brother of the King of England, King Charles at the time. So after the Dutch gave up their rights to New York and New Jersey, there was a bit of a dispute between the certain settlers in New Jersey and what were called the Lord Proprietors of New Jersey. They, the settlers had thought they had struck a deal with the governor of New York and New Jersey, and to claim rights to most of what's currently called New Jersey. But the Duke of York had granted New Jersey to 2 different dukes, one of, I think it was Lord Berkeley and George Carteret, and they split New Jersey into 2 different sections, East Jersey and West Jersey. And Summit was, I believe, in East Jersey. The dividing line sort of went from the southeast to the northwest, so it is not exactly cut in a way that we would sort of think of New Jersey being divided today. But at that point, it was New Jersey, and this particular area was under the control of the Lord Proprietors, and their home base was in Perth Amboy, and that situation lasted until the Revolutionary War, at which time the English gave up control of the U.S. colonies, and at that time it turned over to the colonial government. One interesting fact is that the last royal governor of New Jersey was William Franklin, who was the son of Benjamin Franklin, who we know was part of the Revolutionary War effort, and those two did not speak, I don't think, for most of the rest of their lives. But that's an interesting fact about Benjamin Franklin. No problem. So the Revolutionary War was fought in the Northeast, most of it. There were also a lot of battles down in Virginia and South Carolina, places like that. But in the Northeast, a good bit of the war took place in and around New Jersey. George Washington made his headquarters in the winter, I think, of 1776 in Morristown, and there's still the battlefield is out there, is still marked, and his headquarters in Morristown is a museum and a historical site that you can go visit. There were also a number of battles in and around Summit, the Battle of Short Hills, which was near, very close, and I believe the Battle of Springfield, which were just on the other side of Summit. One interesting fact about Summit in the the Revolutionary War was that there was a fire beacon which was used to signal the colonial forces because Summit is one of the higher peaks in the area, around 400 to 450 feet above sea level. So it was called Beacon Number 10, and it's on the site of where the current Beacon Hill social club is located. But that was a well-known signaling area, and it was called Beacon Number 10, and I think there's a monument there to it today. After the beginning of the war, much of the war moved to other parts of the country, but the Battle of Trenton was obviously very important for Washington to return to New Jersey, and the Battle of Monmouth, which is further south towards the shore. But New Jersey and this particular area has a very interesting Revolutionary War history as well. So the early settlers in and around Summit were just normal farmers and tradesmen and people like that. New Jersey was much like Pennsylvania and Connecticut and upstate New York. So it was a very sparsely populated area. Summit was on the road sort of west of Newark and northwest of Elizabeth on the way to Morristown, which I mentioned before, it was settled earlier and was a bigger town. But that changed in the early or the late 1830s with the advent of the railroads. And Summit was always known as a vacation spot, a country place that people from cities would go because it was higher. It was thought to be more healthy, and in the summer months when the cities got to be crowded and hygiene wasn't so great, it was a place for people to come, spread out, get away from the cities, and have a bit of a vacation or a respite from the crowded cities of the time. That was accelerated by the advent of the railroad, which came out from New York or Jersey City, New York, Jersey City, and Newark, and headed west. One of the big challenges, however, was the fact that since Summit has a higher elevation, whether or not the train engines of the time could pull carriages up the hill, or whether or not they would have to be aided by horses or other animals in order to bring them up. So as the technology for the railways got better and better, it made it easier and easier for railways to get up the hill. Initially, they only had one or two cars, and apparently rail cars were much like stagecoaches at the time, where people were inside and outside, and they had some of the steam engines that could go part of the way, and then they had to be helped by either by horses or cattle or whatever to bring them up the hill. But once that technological challenge had been improved, then the railroads were able to bring many more people up to Summit, and that helped in the settlement and the development of the local town. So the population grew very quickly once the railroads had figured out how to get the carriages, a sufficient, a sufficient number of carriages up the hill. And they called this place not Summit, but the Summit, because it was the highest peak in the area. And once the train was able to come to Summit on its way to Morristown and Hackettstown and places west on a regular basis, they built a small rail depot in downtown Summit, which obviously encouraged development in and around downtown Summit, and the city began to grow. You can see that through the changes in population. In 1850, the population in Summit was 275 people, and by 1872, it was all the way up to 1,300 people. So it grew very quickly, and the downtown area of Summit began to grow with more churches, more businesses, and some of the municipal things that you would see, like a post office, grocery store, schools, things of that nature, started to show up in the the beginning of the second half of the 1800s. So the first hotel in Summit was called the Summit House, and that's where where Central Presbyterian Church currently stands. There is a restaurant now in Summit called the Summit House, which is named after that, but there was no connection, obviously, over 150 years between the two. The Summit was a township from 1859 to 1899, at which time it became a city. The population, particularly the summer population of wealthy people out from New York City, began to grew rapidly in the 1850s and 1860s. It was a short commute into New York of an hour or two, whereas 20 or 30 years ago, when the railways first began, it would take you 2.5 hours to get from Summit just to get to Newark on the train. So that wasn't a whole lot better than going by horse and carriage. One of the interesting things that really aided Summit in growing was the implementation of municipal services. Until the 1880s, there was no public water system or public sewer system. People had to use their own wells. There was a main well by the train station in downtown Summit that a lot of people came to, but unless you had your own well, you had to go share a well with other people in your neighborhood. Sewage as well was another problem. People had privies and outhouses, which were not super sanitary and not all that appealing to people who wanted to come and build homes. There was apparently one wealthy individual who had his own private sewer system that drained into the Passaic River, which is on the Summit-Chatham border. But in the late 1880s, people started to understand that was not very healthy either and was beginning to pollute the Passaic River. So they started to think about a municipal water system as well as a municipal sewer system. Gas and electricity came in right afterwards. And all those things, together with the beginning of a police force and a fire department, started to turn Summit into a real city in the 1880s and 1890s, where people really wanted to come and spend time and build homes and bring their families. So around the turn of the century, the population grew almost to 10,000 people. So it had grown enormously at the second half of the end of the 19th century. One of the most prominent individuals was a guy named Carroll Bassett. And Carroll Bassett, his name is still on buildings in Summit. As a matter of fact, my law office is in the Bassett building, which is named after Mr. Bassett. Beacon Hill Social Club is also was the Bassett family home that was converted into a club in the 1950s. But Mr. Bassett was a very prominent engineer. He had gone to Newark Academy, was from Newark, went to Lafayette and got a bachelor's and a master's and a PhD in engineering. And by the time he was in his late 20s, he was designing sewer systems for the city of Orange as well as other municipalities. The city of Summit hired him, and he built a company up to develop the Summit water and sewer system. And in 1892, that was put into place, and he ended up building the sewer system and sold his company in 1922 for over $5 million, which was a lot of money in 1922. He was also a founder of the Canoebrook Country Club, which is in Summit, and he was one of the most prominent citizens, one of the most important individuals to ever put their imprint on the history of Summit. So once the infrastructure came to Summit and people started to move to Summit, they started to establish a lot of different social organizations, churches and social organizations. The Central Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, St. Teresa's Roman Catholic Church, and a number of others were organized in the late 1800s or the mid to late 1800s, as well as various schools. The public school system isn't what it is now, and much of the education was carried out by private institutions. There was a military academy, there was a boys' academy. I believe St. Teresa's was the first organized elementary school in the city of Summit. So in addition to the churches, a lot of other clubs and organizations started to be organized as well by the local citizens who wanted something to do with their social activities. The Fortnightly Club, which was a women's organization, and they own a home over on the east side of Summit, just off of Springfield Avenue, which is still there, was organized in the late 1880s. And there was a casino club, there was a Masonic group in 1911, the Elks were organized, the Knights of Columbus, so as well as Baltusrol Golf Club in the 1890s and Canoebrook in 1901, which are basically on either side of Summit. All these clubs were organized in order to serve the population, who now had a little bit more time through technological advances, but also more money as the economy grew, and wealthy people from New York City and eastern New Jersey were able to get out to Summit and build homes and come for the summer, or else live full time and commute into the city. So in the late 1880s and 1890s, there was a great amount of activity and economic activity in the city as it grew, as all the municipal services and organizations were put into place, and at that point, Summit really had put itself on the map. So after the turn of the century in the early 1900s, Summit continued to grow. More people were attracted to it since it had lots of different civic organizations and community organizations, and its municipal services were fully in place. And the next thing, I guess, that was important was World War I. There was a lot of patriotic interest in or support for World War I, and a number of Summit citizens served in World War I. There is a very interesting letter that was written by one of the Summit residents who served in World War I, and his and basically was very foreboding about his thoughts about the war and the battles that he was in. And he, in his letter, he essentially foreshadowed his own death by talking about his concerns and his thoughts about his home and his family. And it's available for anybody who wants to read it, but it's really a very poignant, personal testament of somebody from Summit who served in World War I and their experiences. There was also two residents of Summit who were awarded the Medal of Honor for their services, and there is a monument to them on the Memorial Green in downtown Summit, and one of the streets in Summit is named after one of the two recipients of the medal, a man named O'Shea. So in the late 1910s, there was a very important it was a very important time for the city of Summit as they served in as some of its residents served in World War I.
Nice.
The 1920s were very interesting in Summit as well. As the economy grew, Summit also grew and prospered. One of the more interesting individuals who was known at that time was Larned, was a man named William Larned. He was a resident of Summit, and he lived in a mansion that is now the main offices of Oak Knoll School. He was a tennis champion. He was a Wall Street executive. He donated much of the land that is now Memorial Park in Summit, and was very prominent and well known. Unfortunately, he had certain health issues, and in the 1920s or 1930s, I forget exactly when, he ended up committing suicide and killing himself in New York City because of all the health challenges that he faced. But there were a number of things that in his memory in and around Summit, Larned Road, and a few other things. So, but Larned was a very well-known individual who lived in and around Summit and left his imprint on the community. After the 1920s, Summit suffered during the Depression, obviously, like the rest of the country did. There was lots of unemployment and people who were on public assistance, and that really didn't change a whole lot until World War II. And in World War II, the World War II economy basically pulled the country, Summit as well as the rest of the country, out of the Depression. There were a number of Summit residents who served in World War II. There were a number of those residents who gave their lives in World War II, and they are also remembered on the monument down in the Village Green, and that's basically all I know about the 1930s and 1940s. Well, I hope that was a bit informative. I have lived in Summit for a long time, over 35 years, and love the community and love all its history and everything it stands for. It has prospered and grown since we've been here. I think it'll continue to prosper and grow, and I look forward to the next, however long this community lasts, and look forward to all the things that happen to it in the future. So I'm Mike Helmer. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you learned a little bit. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking more about it in the future. Thanks.